Hari, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Great. Yeah, my name is Hari Ravichandran. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Aura. Aura is basically a company that's dedicated to helping families feel safer online. We've got an all-in-one product that helps people take care of cyber threats and try to prevent things from happening versus sort of being reactive. So
And so, is there, I guess the question is, how did you get into that field? Is there something that happened in your life, or was that just, I see a need to fill and I'm going to fill it?
it's very much the former. I had an identity theft incident that happened to me in 2014. I was applying for a mortgage or maybe refinancing a mortgage, and it got denied. And I started looking into it, and there were a whole lot of fake accounts inside my credit. And I got very curious. I'm like, well, how does this happen? Because I'd never really thought much about credit or sort of safe, like personal safety oriented items, especially online. And the more I dug into it, it seemed to me that it was actually a fairly complicated problem without a real solution. There were a lot of point solutions. You talk to the experts and they say, hey, buy this thing and then this thing and this thing. And there were like eight things you got to kind of put together. Um, and there are never really answers as to why and how this happens and how do you prevent it. So that really was my motivation because I'm a technical person and I struggled with that. And so my sense was there's got to be millions of people out there that just have the same kind of problem and a lot of anxiety around it and not know how to fix it. So that was sort of my motivation around being interested in this space and starting Aura.
Gotcha. So, as you're part of going through this, did you learn how your identity got out there, or is it still a mystery to this day?
It's I kind of came upon the most likely situation. I never could prove it one way or the other. I think there had been a data breach some 6 or 8 months prior because that was the first fake account that I saw. And I think the information got leaked out to the dark web. I think it got picked up. A synthetic identity got created, and as long as the credit sort of supported it, if it whether it was one person or sort of a team of two or three people, they kept creating new accounts that got set up. And obviously, I never got the bills
Yeah.
for those accounts, so I had no idea until they defaulted. So they create new credit cards, buy stuff, and then default on it, and that shows up in your credit. And that's the first time you find out that you actually have the card. So that's the closest I got to trying to figure out how this might have happened.
Gotcha. How long did it take from the time that the first account was opened until your refinance triggered the fact that this was going on?
It was 7 months. It was a 7 month window. So by then, I had marks on my credit that was like 3 months overdue, 4 months overdue, and I suspect that if I'd waited a month, there would have been a collections person that kind of came after me. I hadn't quite gotten to that point yet, but it was 6 to 7 months basically.
So they really had 3 to 4 months of playing around and building and utilizing your credit before things started triggering in a negative way.
Exactly. So I think there were probably 2 to 3 months of card setup, et cetera. And then typically the credit companies, as I kind of came to find out, will report 30 days, but it's not always.
Yeah.
Some will report kind of sporadically. And it's not always to all three bureaus, sometimes to one or two bureaus, and sometimes not to the third one. And so for everything to show up in a kind of comprehensive way, it's kind of a six-ish month window is what I would say. So.
Oh, that is just messy. And coming from a technical background and maybe a little bit more understanding of these things, how long from the time that you found out about it until all the issues were taken care of?
It was a long tail, I would say, Chris. I mean, like the basic stuff, which is getting my credit locked and credit frozen, and getting information removed. That actually did take me a few months because again, the bureaus they have this issue where they don't know if it's a real identity theft incident or you just didn't pay your bills and
Yeah.
now you want to kind of go back and have them modify stuff. So I actually had to hire a lawyer to help me go through that part of the process, and then getting rid of all my credit cards, and kind of getting new credit cards issued. That took, at that time, it was probably a week or so right after to kind of get it all back. And then to go back and change all my passwords, modify all the account services. some of the accounts you like, you set up and you just forget that you had that
Yeah.
account, and if you tend to use the same password across many of these, like I used to back then, now those are all at risk, so that took me a while. But the longest tail item was with the IRS because once this incident happened, starting that year, I started every time I'd file my taxes, I'd get a note saying, "Hey, show up to the local field office to prove that you are in fact you. So bring your last 3 years of printed out copies of your
Oh.
tax returns and all this identification stuff." And that actually lasted 5 years. So basically, every year for 5 years, I would get a note saying, "Show up to the local office," to the point where I got to be friends with the lady that was checking to make sure that I wasn't was myself for some years there. So
Yeah, letters from the IRS are never what anyone wants to receive,
yeah, it's it's not fun.
especially for five
Not
years in a
fun.
row.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's there is a long tail to this kind of an incident for sure.
Wow. So what sort of tools does Aura provide to help, and do they shorten this tail, identify earlier? Let's talk about some of those tools.
Yeah, so the thing I kind of realized at that point, which again has been a lot of the driving force behind how we thought about product for Aura, is your life is not in pieces. There's not just like identity. There's not viruses on your computer. There's not just transactions that are kind of quirky type of thing. It's like one large continuum. Like your security is a large continuum in a lot of ways. And so to be able to get a full view of your security footprint, you have to look at all of that data. So whether it's your transaction data, it's your desktop, file scans for if there's malware, viruses type of thing, browser data, it's your connected device data at home. So that was at the core of kind of what we started building, was how do you get a holistic view of this individual or this family, and what do they actually do, and where are their safety gaps basically.
Hmm.
And then initially it was a little bit more reactive, where you say, okay, if we find an issue, how do you speed up the learning of the family? So in our case, let's say it's an identity incident like the one I had, we made sure that we were connected to all three bureaus on the back end. So you would get an alert from any of the three of them if there was sort of an incident within a few minutes, basically. So it's like
Hmm.
rapid alerting. And over time, we've kind of morphed now to how do you try to prevent these things? The way we think about it is, let's say your house is on fire and you've got, you want to have a really good fire alarm so you can kind of get there as quickly as possible. But if you're still getting the alert, there's still a problem. Your house is still on fire. And
Yeah.
so the best thing would probably be to prevent the fire if you can. And so that's a lot of our product direction now, is how do you do things proactively so you can prevent these incidents, which could range anywhere from, looking for patterns. And if the patterns look a little quirky, automatically locking your credit on your behalf, or both prompting and assisting you in changing passwords of vulnerable accounts, making sure that you've got real-time scanning happening out in the world. So a lot of these actions end up creating a real security view of that individual or family,
Hmm.
and then coming up with the ways that we can help them thwart potential issues.
Yeah, that's so many of the tools involving identity theft up until now have really been more reactionary. Well, I think one of the companies has always advertised it as like, well, it's great, but you want the security guard to stop the event as opposed to
Yep.
say, hey, guess what? Someone broke into your
Yeah,
building.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no. There's definitely value in knowing it, but there's a lot more value in preventing it for sure.
And is that just part of how the market has grown and kind of this space has moved from being reactive to being proactive?
I think the reactive to proactive part, there's a few underlying trends. I would say, there's a lot more demand for these kinds of solutions now because families are a lot more connected than ever before. Like in our home, at any given point in time, between the kids' devices, my wife's devices, there's probably 50, 60 devices that are online and operational. And these are like 60 potential, entry points into your
Hmm.
digital life to be able to gather data. So a lot more data, a lot more connected devices. Families are a lot more connected. So that's on the from a criminal's perspective. Now you've got a lot more entry points to get this stuff. Now on the good guys tally, there's a lot more technology, especially with AI and data processing anymore. We've got the ability to scan through lots of things to be able to predict what could be potentially risky. Like for example, the way we do it is we create a large security graph with all of our customers' data, and we try to kind of traverse through it, and we say, okay, based on this set of patterns for this individual or family, and we do it in near real time. We say, okay, you've got a high risk of this kind of incident happening, and once we know that, then we can try to cater the solution in a way that makes sense for you and your family. So
Hmm.
that bit of it gets enabled because um, you know there's been more and more emergence of available compute, a lot more, sort of the compute cost has come down quite a bit, and a lot more learning models and ML and AI that have the ability to predict based on the past, basically as well. So
So is it the present or future where you can start to look at these are normal behaviors and start to see, hey, there's something going on here on the financial side that's out of line with the consumer's behavior. Here's more data moving around than we normally see. Is that
so
sort of where you're
that's
going or
also
what you're doing?
yeah, that's I would say we're halfway there. We're not all the way there yet, and every day we get closer and closer. Like, but like I'll give you a couple examples. With our new product we're rolling out now, like let's say you get a phone call, the product will now analyze the call as it's coming into your phone, and it'll ask you to say your intent, like why are you calling, and based on the intonations and the words you're using, it'll determine intent. So if it thinks that you have scam intent, then it'll route you automatically to a messaging system where you can kind of leave a message if you want to, transcribe it and send it over to your app so you can actually scroll through and look at it. If it looks like it's legitimate, it will forward that to you. So that's doing all that in real time as a call's coming in. That tech didn't used to be readily available 3 or 4 years ago. Another example I'll give you is let's say I'm looking at your transaction patterns, with your bank account or a credit card, and I say, well, if Chris is spending $200 at Amazon, that doesn't seem weird because I see the data patterns where you actually do that periodically. But if you're spending $200 at Starbucks, something's off kilter
Yeah.
because that is not contextually what you typically tend to do. So that again, uh, if you have all of that data sitting inside one sort of central store and you've got it mapped out in a smart way, we can do that in almost near real time, basically. So we keep launching more and more use cases. Like the central trove of stuff is available, but every week, we're like, okay, well, here's another thing we're seeing with customers. Let's roll out a case for that so we can, help them prevent that issue, type of thing, basically.
Yeah, there was a particular incident in my past that I was always impressed with, and I've never quite been able to figure it out. Is someone had cloned my credit card or created a credit card with my number and used it at a local hardware store, not too far, like within the range of what I would normally travel. So if you looked at my purchase history and the zip codes, you'd say, okay, that's within his normal history of where he goes, and they tried to purchase, or maybe they did, a gift card or something like that at a name brand hardware store,
Yeah,
and they sent me an alert saying, "Hey, we think this is a fraudulent transaction. Can you confirm this?"
yeah,
And I was particularly impressed because I was like, it's very conceivable that I would go to that store. It's very
yep,
conceivable that I would spend that amount of money. How
yep.
did you know that that was the fraudulent transaction and stop it?
Yeah, that is actually pretty good. Like, because typically when you do geofencing, you will see that, hey, like there's another version of a Hari somewhere in Miami, like, buying gas. And I go, oh, okay, well, that's not the case because I see other transactions from the real me in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And so clearly, one is sort of off kilter. But, the printing of the credit card, I mean, that, you can go to the dark web, you can buy troves of credit card numbers, that kind of get pulled up in a breach or something like that. But the example you go through is good because whoever the criminal there was, um, kind of knew how to fence themselves inside the right geo
Yeah.
and kind of keep it under a certain range. Which, yeah, I am curious how they were able to determine it. That is actually pretty cool. So yeah,
Unfortunately, I can't say that they've been consistent about it, but I was just impressed with this one transaction. There was something about it, or something about similar transactions that were happening at the same time, that the credit card company was able to
identify it. Yeah,
identify it, which is neat if that starts to become more and more the future when it works. But I imagine when you get systems that are overly protective and you get false positives, that becomes another
I know it's an
problematic
annoyance, right?
situation.
Yeah, it's an annoyance, and people then get immunized to it in the sense that, if I keep sending a bunch of alerts that don't mean anything, at some point they're like, okay, like it's like the boy who cried wolf. And so I don't, I'm not going to bother looking at it anymore. And so, and it's a nuisance factor. Like, like for example, even with the financial alerting, like we would go to customers and say, hey, set up a threshold of where you think your alerts uh, are odd, or like set up a limit, like a threshold or a limit. And like people would set up like $50 or like $500 because nobody, like, you don't know how much you spend on a per transaction basis, right? And so if it's 50, they get like 50 alerts and they say, oh my God, like this is like really irritating to me. And if it's 500, maybe they don't have that many transactions, so you don't get very many at all. So then we said, okay, well, I think we're asking the customer a question that they don't have an easy time answering.
Yeah.
So let's actually go figure it out with the data. And so, and that's when we started doing something called smart thresholding, like that we do now. But those are the type of things you learn about how much customers pay attention to stuff,
Yeah.
and how much can you use systems, data, AI to actually make their lives a little bit easier. Because at the end of the day, like our simple vision is like families and users just need an easy button. I mean, they basically should be able to go, you know, and say, hey, like, I want to pay you my $15 a month, and I don't want to worry about this stuff, and just make sure that it all kind of works in the back end, because everybody's got busy lives, and they've got other commitments, and don't want to worry about this stuff. That's at the core of the problem. So
Yeah, I've run into the same thing while setting credit card alert amounts. I think I found the sweet spot now that works for my wife and I. That we get alerted on the things that matter, and on the things that are too small, we're not overwhelmed with alerts. But I did have internet. We travel internationally from time to time, and I had international. Anytime there's a 1 cent transaction internationally, alert me, because
yeah,
for the most part, I'm not going to be traveling internationally. If I'm buying from a vendor overseas, I kind of want to know that I felt that was safe. And then we recently went traveling, and it got very old very quickly that every time I used the credit card, I
yeah.
got an email, I got a text message, I got an alert in the app.
Yeah. And and even like with the bank example you're talking about, like when I travel internationally, if it's off pattern, now I've learned to actually call the credit card company, because if not, when I go there, it doesn't actually work. Like, as soon as I try to take money out of an ATM, they're like, okay, for security reasons, we've actually now blocked you. And so then it's like a hassle. You're trying to pay a cab or something like that, and you don't have cash. And so now before I travel, I call them up and say, hey, I'm gonna be in this place. Can you make sure that the alert doesn't trip? And I'd say it's 50-50. Like, half the time they kind of get it, and half the time, it still happens no matter what. But
Yeah, I've it's funny because I used to have the banks used, at least where I bank, they used to say, we want you to tell us when you're traveling internationally, and now they specifically say, we don't want you to tell us.
oh,
And I'm
interesting.
like, okay, you're sending mixed signals to me. And then I did have one. This is kind of the running joke between my wife and I. One of our cards, if we're going to travel internationally and a card's going to get compromised that year, it will get compromised within 24 hours of us leaving the country.
Yep,
So if we're going to leave on a Thursday, I get an email on Wednesday saying, hey, the card's been compromised. We're going to cancel the card. We'll send you a new one, and we'll FedEx it. And I'm like, well,
yep.
unless it can be here before I need to
By
leave for the
tomorrow.
airport.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the one bank was like, well, I could do overnight, but I can't guarantee morning delivery. And I was like, oh
Yeah.
gosh, what can I do? And I was actually pretty impressed because their suggestion was, well, the fraudulent transactions are happening in the United States. How about this? We will only let your card work in the countries that you're going to
International.
visit,
There you go.
which is like usually the opposite of most people's behavior. So I don't want my card working internationally. I only want it working in the US. So like, well, we can cancel it in the US and have it work
That's great.
internationally. And then
And
when
then
you
when you
get
come back,
back,
you have your new card. Yeah,
we'll have a new card.
exactly.
I was like, hey,
Yeah.
that is a great solution.
Yep.
And
It's
it's
great.
nice to
It's fantastic.
see that entities are trying to be more solution oriented as opposed to, hey, we're going to send you a new card. We don't care what you do or don't want. And if it sits on your porch for 3 days while you're out of town, tough luck.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. I do think people are getting smarter about the hassle factor, because so many get affected by it. And so I do think that systems are progressing and getting better as well. I still think there's a lot of gaps and I mean, like, like for example, on our site, we have a lot of content around different phishing scams or different scams that happen. And sometimes I'll talk to customers, just on the chat, and I'm still amazed by how many variants of different scams
Yeah.
there are out there. It's like ranging from Facebook scams to romance scams to any variety of like human need set. People are able to now socially exploit and find a way to actually pilfer money from it. So and some of them are like fairly ingenious. Like
Yeah.
it's just yeah, and so very very clever, very clever.
I think one of the challenging things is it used to be that you could say, hey, just watch out for someone who says this phrase. If they say this phrase, you know it's a scam.
Yeah, it was a
Um,
Nigerian prince, right? I mean,
yeah. If someone says I'm a prince, ignore it. Guess what? They're not a prince. They're
yeah,
not your long lost relative. They don't have lots of money for you. It was easy. But so many of these scams have gotten so nuanced and there's so many flavors of them and they come out so fast, they adapt so quickly to what's going on in the world that it's almost you can't tell people watch out for this specifically. It's now you have to recognize this much wider pattern that's going
yeah,
on.
and yeah, and then that then puts the onus on the uh, individual or the user because now they have to kind of become better pattern recognition. It's like, oh, like this is happening. I think that this could be a scam, so I'm going to be more cautious here. But I'm not sure. Should I respond? Should I not respond? So it does put a little bit more pressure and sort of stress on the individual. But you're exactly right. I mean, there's just too many variants uh, that unless so we're working on some solutions even for the different scam variants because we've been studying that for a while. Uh, but again, without AI, without the learning systems, it'd be practically impossible because there's just too many flavors of it and it changes very, very
Yeah.
dynamically. So
And I think the one to mention as we're recording this, this is in mid February. There's been a big earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And I haven't seen them yet, but it's just a matter of time before the fake charities start popping up and saying,
100%.
hey, help people. For those that are good natured and want to help, it's sad that we have to warn people you can't trust people contacting you, asking you for help in natural
Especially
disasters.
the inbound one, and and we're just past Valentine's, and believe it or not, that's a huge spike window for a lot of romance scams.
Yep.
Setting up catfishing kind of profiles, using that to then demand money. And so I think the social engineers know how to prey on vulnerabilities of regular folks, and the two biggest sort of vulnerable elements inside a family that we find are kids and elders.
Hmm.
So I think they kind of really target that. Like with the elders, for example, they know to call at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is sort of the dip in their day. They'll use keywords like uh, church, services, etc. That then gets the elder to open up. And so they've gotten so smart, and it's sort of very programmatic now that the pressure then comes back to the user to say, okay, well, I need to know about this stuff, and I need to protect myself to make sure that I don't, get in trouble. So
Yeah. So I know that you are huge on protecting connected families with your products and whatnot. What is the kind of the most common low hanging fruit weak spot that people should be like? If there's one thing that you start to work on,
I'll sort of give you one that's almost a tie, I would say. So I'm going to give you two. One is definitely going to turn on MFA in all your
yeah,
devices to make sure that you've got 2FA or sort of whatever the factoring protocol is. If you have the ability to with the service, make sure you turn it on. The second is don't use the same passwords across all your services. Like try and use a password manager because again, if you have 50 different services, now if you think about it, one gets breached, now all other ones are in trouble as well. So kind of
yeah.
make sure that you're kind of segregating your risk a little bit as well. So
So I have a question about two-factor authentication that I ask everybody when we talk about two-factor authentication, and it's one of those everybody has an opinion
yeah,
question about 2FA. So the way I look at it, there's three primary 2FA mechanisms: SMS messages, which pretty much everybody's familiar with.
Yep.
an authenticator app, which is basically the same sort of thing but within an application,
Yep.
and then a hardware token.
Yep.
So, what is your kind of view on not necessarily? So, I think the conventional wisdom is uh, hardware token is going to be the most secure,
Yep.
and then authenticator app, and then SMS. And so, security purists will say SMS, don't even bother. It's not worth it. Don't waste your time.
Yep.
Only go with a hardware token. But I know
Yep.
my
No,
mom is not going to use a hardware token.
and therein is the problem, right? I mean, so you have to look at the convergence of, the purity of tech and the usability of the tech as well, right? So in a lot of ways, if you say, hey, you have to go get a hardware token to be able to kind of, cycle through the code, so it's changing much more frequently, an elder would have a lot of trouble, and so they would do nothing, right? So now you're back to, like, if it's a spectrum of 0 to 10
Yeah,
for safety, you'd rather somebody be at a 3 or 4 by using either an app or SMS, which is much easier to use, versus being at a 0 because the hardware is so hard to go get, set up, and not be able to use. Now, if you're an enterprise, it's a different story, right? Where you have an IT team, you have the ability to train your employees, and so in that kind of a setup, at a minimum, doing app based, whether it's Okta or whatever the services that you decide to use, uh, that is, feels like the bare minimum, to be honest, versus sort
mm-hmm.
of a text based thing, again, for an enterprise. Uh, but for a family, if you can even get them to do SMS based 2FA, that's better than not having that at all. Like, it may not, yes, and the security purists are right. I mean, there are many cases where that can be spoofed and there could be lots of issues that you can kind of create out of it. But if it reduces the incidence of fraud by 30, 40, 50%, you're still better off with that because it's usable versus have nothing at all.
Yeah.
Is sort of the way I see it. So
Yeah, that's generally the my belief on it as well. Is I'd rather have insufficient security versus no security.
100%. And it is a spectrum, right? I mean, again, if you are in that like little bulk where, you know, uh, you're already a 9, but like a nation state is coming after you or something like that. Like, again, the amount of security and the kind of surveillance and stuff you need to set up there is very different than a regular person that basically is just trying to go about their lives and, don't want to think about 5 passwords, so they're using the same password over and over again and have no periphery security and nothing kind of washing out for them. So if you can bring that person to, like, from a 0 to a 5, it's still movement in the right way, is sort of the way I see it.
Yeah, some security is better than no security.
100%, 100%. Yeah.
So I know you have a book that, as of this episode launches, it will be immediately available. Intelligent Safely: How to Protect Your Connected Family from Big Cybercrime.
Yeah.
I've done a number of episodes on that. Like, cybercrime is no longer the guy sitting in his mom's basement, but it's big business. It's big,
Yep.
corporation. It's almost corporations. It's
Yep. Yep.
it's groups of people doing very complex things these days. You know, what are families supposed to be able to do versus entities that have made it their mission to get as much money from people as they can.
Yeah, I think what you said is really insightful and important, because what, like 10, 15 years ago, if somebody was hacking into, somebody else's devices, it's maybe a script kiddie that wanted to go tell their buddies that, hey, like, I got into that system. It's like for pride and that type of stuff. And now it's an organized system, right? There are people that harvest data. There are people that know how to monetize the data. There are exchanges where you can kind of transmit and kind of look through the data. I think a little bit, for at least sort of the motivation behind the book for me, around this intelligent safety notion, is just making people aware of the fact that there is so much of this stuff going on underneath the surface. Because if it's not part of your line of sight and your filter day by day, you just don't think about it, because you get occupied with with whatever your day is kind of bringing your way. So this is sort of a way to say, hey, there is a lot of this happening. Um, it's something you have to pay attention to. It's almost a step-by-step guide that basically helps people first understand and then how to think about security. And again, it's less around, buy our product or whatever. It's less that's less the motivation for us here. It's more that this is a real problem that a lot of people are unaware. until it hits them right in the face. Like in my case, my identity got stolen. And then you've got this huge pain point on the back end where you now have to go back and clean up all this stuff. That's, lack of like a few weeks after that happened, like I was not very focused at work. Like I was like, oh
Yeah.
my God, I got to go solve this issue. Like I'm not available for my family because I'm like stressed out about this stuff, saying, hey, like, is this going to be a real problem for me or not? And so, and then that tail continued for a while. So just being aware, smart, leveraging some technology that's already out there, and kind of turning the tables a little bit on the bad guys. Can you sort of get yourself protected enough that they're not able to kind of get into your systems or your periphery. And like we were saying earlier, a basic amount of protection is still better than none at all on the back end. So, and I think it's more kind of helping people understand the landscape, understanding what they can actually do, and giving like real examples of, hey, like this actually happened. And some of the examples are like, wow, like I didn't think that that could happen, but it makes sense that it did, and now it could impact my life in this manner.
I mean, do you see that consumers need to, we were talking earlier about, you've got 40 or 50 devices connected to your network in your household, and I've got about the same amount here as well. And at some point in the recent past, I was looking at some of the tech that I had on my network and went, this is let me check for firmware updates on these. These things have been on my network for a long time. Let me check for
Yep,
firmware updates.
yep,
And I was kind of surprised there were a couple of devices that had been on my network for 4 or 5 years, and there were no firmware updates. And I'm like,
yep, yep,
that's coming from a computer background, a programming background. There's things break all the time. Mistakes are always made. For there to be no firmware updates means no one's maintaining this. So whatever
exactly right.
weaknesses this thing has, it's got weaknesses for 5 or 10 years. I bought this because it was cheap.
Yep,
And do
yep,
consumers have to start thinking differently about the things that we connect to the network in terms of not just what's the security profile, but is this thing going to be made? It's one thing. It's like, oh, I want a doorbell camera. Oh, let me just
yep.
buy the cheapest one that beats the bill, as opposed to who's going to maintain the security of this thing for as long as I have it installed in my front door.
It's you got to go one way or the other, which is either put some sort of protection on top of what you're buying to make sure that you are in control of your own security, or do the diligence on, hey, is this something like, I mean, like, think about it in the physical world, right? Let's say you like, how often do you invite a complete random stranger into your home?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you don't. You basically say, okay, well, this person could be crazy and they could, try to, do something harmful to me or my family. And so you're always thoughtful about it. You lock your doors. It's not like you leave your windows open and lock the doors, but you lock everything if you can. So in a lot of ways, if you think about your digital life in the same way, which is, you know, who are you letting inside your network? Are you making sure that all your doors and windows are locked? And if there isn't somebody entering your digital world, do you have enough, uh, sort of sentries in place that kind of are alerting you, letting you know this is happening, helping you prevent some of these negative issues from happening? So you either have to go that path where you're getting a service or getting some set of services that get you comfortable, or you got to go down the path of saying, okay, I know that this company is well funded. They have a real reputation to maintain. And if they get breached or their devices get breached, that's going to be reputationally really bad for them. So it may cost a little bit more, but the price you pay when you add it all up, if something negative were to happen, is going to far exceed the extra dollars you're paying for that piece of hardware or device.
Yeah, you hope that's the case. Unfortunately, I think there have been a couple of notable bad choices by a couple of large companies. I know Eufy had an incident
Yeah.
recently where, well, they hadn't really maintained data the way they should.
Yeah, no, there's definitely those types of things that happen. So you are paying, but you're playing a little bit of the probability game, right? Just again, if these things look right, I mean, it's a big company, probably have a lot of resources, probably care about their reputation. Doesn't mean that it's always the case, but it's better than somebody that you say, hey, hasn't launched a firmware update in 10 years.
Yeah,
So sort of the two ends of the spectrum, if you will, right? So, but at the end of the day, like the big lesson is it's a little bit buyer beware, right? I mean, so it's basically comes down to the individual or the family. And So that's sort of where our mission comes in, which is, hey, like, how do you actually aid these folks? Because if I go to my mom and say, hey, you got to do all this stuff to keep yourself safe, she's like, okay, like, can you just do it for me? Like, I don't know, I don't know what to do. And and that's how, like, I might be able to help her, but there may be families where, you don't have the time or, the expertise to be able to help them. So kind of helping guide these folks and making sure that they're safe is a large part of what we do on a day-by-day basis. So,
Do you see, and maybe this is the challenge that you're trying to address, is that as we get more and more technology involved in our lives, it's harder to maintain that tech, harder to understand what the risks are of it. Like even me living, from a tech perspective, gosh, it's like I just don't know all the risks that every device brings. And
yeah.
how are we supposed to be experts about all of this, even if we want to be?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, you can just apply some best practices up front, and then after that, you kind of have to, whether it's our service or a series of eight other services, you're, going to go by individually. You kind of have to put that stuff in place because if you don't, as you're saying, like I can't be an expert on the Ring and on Alexa and on, Nest and all of these different things. Like no one person can do all of that stuff. And so you definitely need something that's a sentry that kind of keeps you safe. Um, and it's like technology is amazing. It makes our life so much more easy, so much more convenient. But I don't think a lot of people equate, ease of use is a compromise against security. Like
Yeah,
it doesn't feel like it ought to be that way. Like those should not be the parallel opposing ends. But unfortunately, the way it's set up now, it kind of is. Like the more tech you enable, the less secure you are
yeah,
because of all these things we've been talking about in some ways. And so that's just how the ecosystem has evolved, unfortunately. And it's a constant battle. Like I mean, again, I'm an optimistic person, so I feel like every day, every week, every year, people do get better, things do get more safe. The criminals also unfortunately get smarter, and so the
yeah,
same tech also enables them. And so it's always this cat and mouse, but overall, it's a good trajectory for sure.
yeah. So you're not saying we should all just unplug everything and go live in a cave?
You know, you would certainly be safe, that's for sure. But you would also probably be bored out of your mind at that time as well. So
Yeah, I don't think anyone wants to unplug their refrigerator.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think those days are gone. So
So when it comes to people's, let's try to get practical on something useful for people with a connected home. Is there something, here's one thing that you can do to keep your connected home safer from cybercrime?
yeah, I think anything that's able to kind of monitor. I mean, there's lots of solutions out there for IoT scanning and IoT security. That basically will list your device. It'll basically tell you sort of when the last update was on the device, etc. And you kind of have a little console so you can kind of look to see what's happening inside your household. That I think is very beneficial. I do think that again, like we were saying, on the front end, if you can do a little bit of diligence before you buy things that
Hmm.
you're putting into your home, do they have a history of breaches? Like for example, like for our kids, we're buying baby cameras. Those are enabled with IP addresses, as you might know, and so we did a little bit of work to see if there was any incidents of like breaches or break-ins
Hmm.
through these devices because that again is your most precious property. Like it's
Yeah.
your kids, it's your privacy, and so doing a little bit of diligence up front will go a long ways. It doesn't give you a guarantee in the sense that like as you were saying, you know even with the smartest programmers, security bugs can happen. It's just like too complicated a system. But you're bettering your odds, to make sure that your home is not crazy vulnerable, basically.
Do you see a time when the recommendation will, routers will ship with implemented kind of security zones by default, where it's like, okay, here's put your computer and your phone on this network, your IoT stuff on this, and put your kids on this. Do you kind of see manufacturers going that direction at some point?
Again, it comes back to that same thing we're talking about with the 2FA piece. It's the convenience
Yeah.
versus the security piece of it, right? Because if you're starting to zone out your router and you're basically telling people to connect things into different ports or set up different zones inside your Wi-Fi. If you're a technical person, you're like, oh wow, you just made my life a whole lot easier because I don't have to go do that all manually. But if you are my mom, she says, oh, like, I was just trying to figure out where to plug the wires in, and now I got to go do all this other stuff. And
That's a
so,
good point.
yeah, yeah. So that I think is the struggle for router makers as well, which is how do you make it as easy as possible and as safe as possible? And unfortunately, sometimes those are in dire conflict. If you make it very easy, it's hard technically to actually get things separated and isolated, I think.
Yeah. Convenience and security are have a certain amount of opposition to one
Yeah,
another.
it's yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right. So
So, where can people find the book and the title again?
the title of the book is Intelligent Safety. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at sort of any bookstore site, and feel free to read it. I feel like it's got a lot of good tips that would be helpful for folks, and hopefully gets you a little bit more educated on this ecosystem and how it all works, and keep your family a bit safer.
Awesome. And if people want to find about more about the services that Aura offers,
Aura.com, Aura.com.
well, that's just too easy. And if people want to find you online, where can they find you?
You can find me on. I'm on Twitter. I'm on through our sort of work Instagram. It's available as well, and via email. It's all sort of listed on the site. So feel free to drop me a line. Happy to talk with you.
And we'll link to all those in the show notes. Who, for those who don't want to have to scribble and write things down, we'll make it easy for you and link to it all.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Chris.
Hari, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Wonderful. Great to see you, and I appreciate all the time.
Thank you.